Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. George Orwell's chilling words were not merely a warning about a fictional dystopia. They were a diagnosis of power itself. For centuries, we have been told a story, a neat linear story of our own history. A story of rise, a catastrophic fall into darkness, and a glorious rebirth. But what if the darkest chapter in that story wasn't a fall, but a push? What if the lights didn't just go out, but were deliberately extinguished? Tonight, we journey into the heart of history's most unsettling void. The 1,000 years they call the Dark Ages. We are told it was an era of ignorance, chaos, and lost knowledge. But we will ask a question that history books are afraid to answer. Was it an age of darkness or an age of shadows? A time when history wasn't lost, but meticulously, systematically, and ruthlessly hidden by the one institution that stood to gain everything from its disappearance. Prepare yourself, for the truth is far more complex and infinitely more terrifying than the fiction we have been taught to believe.
Welcome to Secrets of the Ancients, where ancient mysteries awaken.
The story, as it is officially told, begins in the year 476 AD. It is the moment modern history books mark as the death knell of the Western Roman Empire. A child of royal blood, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. An empire that had lasted for centuries, a civilization that had defined the known world, vanished after a seemingly bloodless coup. This single event, we are taught, signals the abrupt start of the Dark Ages. Yet, the strangest thing about this monumental collapse is the silence that surrounds it. No one living at that time called it a collapse. No funeral bells rang out from the Roman Forum. There was no grand funeral for an empire that had once conquered nearly the entire Western world. More unsettling still, no one truly recorded in detail what happened next. You would think such a cataclysmic event would leave behind a clear and blazing trail in history. A mountain of documents, chronicles, memoirs, or at the very least, personal letters and first-hand accounts. But curiously, the deeper you dig into the historical record from the 5th to the 8th century, the denser the fog becomes. Historical records grow fragmented, contradictory, and hazy, sometimes reduced to mere brief, cryptic notes from monks written centuries after the fact. It's as if the entire continent had fallen into a deep, collective amnesia, or more chillingly, as if someone wished it to appear that way. This is the first great anomaly we must confront. The Romans were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything: military campaigns, tax receipts, legal codes, senatorial debates, public works, even personal graffiti. How could a society so obsessed with documentation simply cease to write its own story at the most critical juncture in its existence? Consider the story of a man named Cassiodorus, a high-ranking Roman official who lived through this very period. He served under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy after the fall. Cassiodorus was a scholar, a statesman, and a historian. He wrote voluminously, attempting to bridge the Roman and Gothic worlds. Yet his later work took a dramatic turn. He founded a monastery, vivarium, and dedicated his life to a new project, the copying of manuscripts. But which manuscripts? Overwhelmingly, they were religious texts. He compiled a work called The Institutions, a guide for his monks on how to read, copy, and understand Scripture. The great secular works of Roman law, science, and philosophy were secondary, if they were considered at all. This wasn't an isolated case. It was the blueprint for the coming age. As the secular world of Rome crumbled, the Christian church, in its early form, rose like the lone beacon still standing in the ruins. But the light it cast, was it truly meant to illuminate the way, or simply to blind the eyes to any other path? Entire libraries, schools, and research centers of the ancient world were burned, repurposed, or cleansed in the name of faith. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts in Greek, secular Latin, and Coptic quietly disappeared from the map of knowledge. Only those texts painstakingly copied into doctrinal Latin, a language increasingly accessible only to a specially trained clerical elite, were allowed to survive. And those surviving texts were kept nowhere else but within the fortified walls of monasteries, churches, and ultimately, the Vatican's burgeoning secret archives. No secular power remained strong enough to resist this intellectual consolidation. No independent scholarly system existed to verify the truth. For hundreds of years, what Europeans knew of their own past was only what the Vatican allowed them to know. So, was the Dark Ages truly an era of human backwardness? Or was it a manufactured fog, a carefully engineered silence designed to conceal something deeper, something darker? Perhaps history was not lost, merely sealed away. And if that is the case, the question is no longer what happened, but who wants you to never know that it happened at all. If you look at the historical landscape of Europe from the 5th to the 10th century, you won't see the vibrant colors of blood, fire, or intellectual breakthrough. Instead, you'll find a thin, gray layer of dust covering everything, from the great structures that once stood to the very memory of its people. We are told that no clearly documented major wars, no significant scientific discoveries, and no grand architectural achievements emerged from this period. It's as if the entire continent had slipped into a deep hibernation. But this was no natural sleep. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy, suffocating blanket over Europe, blocking the light and erasing memory. Even cities that once thrived, Milan, Lyon, Cologne, left behind no new trace for centuries. No philosophical manuscripts, no innovative paintings, no new maps, and strangest of all, no stories. Those who lived through that era, if they did, left no account, or their voices were systematically erased by unseen hands. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was on fire with innovation. If you glance toward China during the Sui and Tang dynasties, it was a golden age. Block printing was invented, intricate musical instruments evolved, and poetry reached sublime new heights with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu. Further west, in the Arab world, science flourished under the Abbasid Caliphate. The great astronomer and mathematician Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. The first public hospitals were established, and the Library of Baghdad held hundreds of thousands of ancient manuscripts from across the world. And Europe seemed blissfully unaware of gears, advanced astronomy, or even the compass. In a world where the East was ablaze with light, the West appeared to have been deliberately drained of its memory. Who stood to gain from this intellectual vacuum? The answer lies not beyond Europe, but within it. It had been there all along, quiet, unwavering, and growing ever stronger. The Church. When the people believed they were living through an age of utter darkness, when they were taught that their ancestors had been lost to pagan superstition and ignorance, they would not question. They would not doubt the one, singular truth preached from the pulpit, the Word of God, spoken exclusively through the mouths of priests. They would not seek knowledge because they were told books no longer existed or were filled with heresy. They would not explore because any independent pursuit of knowledge was deemed a dangerous path away from salvation. The Vatican didn't need to force compliance through overt violence, though it would later master that art. In these formative centuries, They only needed to set one powerful, pervasive definition: darkness, and let fear and ignorance do the rest. In a world without debate, without invention, without competing narratives, one might assume that nothing happened. But sometimes, the most prolonged and profound silence is the clearest sign of a hidden crime, the erasure of an entire chapter of human history. Let us imagine a story, a fiction to illustrate a possible truth. Picture a monk named Brother Alcuin in a remote monastery in Gaul around the year 700 AD. He is one of the few literate men for 100 miles. In his scriptorium, he has two manuscripts before him. One is a copy of the Gospels. The other is a crumbling scroll, a Latin translation of a work by the Greek engineer Hero of Alexandria, detailing designs for steam engines, automata, and complex gear systems. The parchment for the Gospel is scarce. The abbot has instructed that all available resources must be used to preserve the Word of God. The pagan text, full of worldly distractions and useless knowledge, is to be scraped clean so its expensive vellum can be reused. Alcuin, in a moment of intellectual curiosity, reads a passage from Hero's text. He sees a world of possibility, of machines that could ease labor, of a power beyond that of a horse or an ox. But he also feels a prick of fear. This knowledge does not speak of God. It speaks of human ingenuity. It elevates man, not the divine. To preserve it would be an act of defiance. To destroy it is an act of faith. With a heavy heart and a prayer on his lips, he takes his scraping knife and begins the slow, arduous process of turning a work of mechanical genius into a blank page, ready for the sacred text. Now multiply that moment by 10,000 in 1,000 monasteries over 500 years. This was not a war of swords, but a war of ink and parchment, of selection and erasure. History is not merely what happened. It is what has been told. And when the only voices left to tell the story belong to men in clerical robes, that story will inevitably reflect not an objective truth, but a carefully chosen one. Throughout history, there are silences so profound they make us wonder, did those periods truly exist? This leads us to one of the most audacious and mind-bending theories concerning the Dark Ages, a theory so radical it threatens to collapse our entire understanding of the past. It is known as the phantom time hypothesis. First proposed in the late 20th century by German historian Herbert Illig, the hypothesis claims that roughly 300 years of the first millennium, from approximately 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. He argues that this period was artificially inserted into the calendar, a ghost era filled with fabricated events and cloned historical figures. In other words, we may be living in a timeline that was deliberately falsified, and the year we call 2025 might, in reality, be closer to 1728. At first, the idea sounds absurd, the stuff of fiction. But when you examine the scattered, puzzling clues within European historical records, it begins to send an undeniable chill down your spine. First, there is the archaeological gap. As Illig and his supporters point out, there is a distinct lack of archaeological evidence that can be reliably and exclusively dated to this specific 297-year period in many parts of Europe. Romanesque architecture, for example, appears in the 11th century with a sophistication that seems to spring from nowhere, suggesting it is a direct successor to late Roman styles, with the intervening centuries being an empty placeholder. Second, there is the problem of the historical record itself. Why are there so few reliable, contemporary accounts recorded during that specific span? Why do historical texts from different regions frequently contradict one another when dating the same events? And most bizarrely, why do certain kings, battles, and even entire dynasties appear to be mere copies of earlier history, only with different names. One of the most striking examples is the figure of Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800, right in the middle of this phantom time. Charlemagne's story shares uncanny similarities with that of Constantine the Great from the 4th century. From their sweeping military campaigns and forms of governance to their legal and administrative reforms, the parallels are often too precise to be mere coincidence. It feels like a historical reprint, a story retold to fill a void. Yet for centuries, no one dared to question it. So, who would have both the power and the motive to manipulate the very flow of time? Illig points to three powerful figures: the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, who reigned around the year 1000 AD, his close confidant, the brilliant monk and historian Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, and of course, the Vatican itself. The proposed motive is compelling. Otto III was obsessed with restoring the glory of Rome and wanted to be reigning in the auspicious year 1000 AD. By inserting a few phantom centuries, he could position his reign at this divinely appointed moment. An empire could legitimize its rule in the eyes of God simply by adjusting the timeline. And if the Church wished to declare its authority as granted by ancient prophecy, then the timeline itself became the perfect, malleable tool. This was also the period when the Church was meticulously constructing its own history, creating an unbroken line of popes stretching back to St. Peter. If a few hundred years of history happened to be missing, what better way to fill the gap than to invent them, complete with a list of popes to ensure the chain of succession remained sacred and unbroken? Curiously, the Vatican has never publicly refuted this theory in detail, but neither has it confirmed it. As with so many uncomfortable moments in its history, the Church's silence is not necessarily a denial. It is a way to keep every possibility within its grasp, so that no one can definitively verify or disprove the truth. A force that controls both knowledge and time has no need to argue. It need only outlast all doubt. And so, we are left with a haunting possibility, that we may be living within a history that has been edited like a theological manuscript, crafted by those who understood how to wield time itself as the ultimate tool of dominion, not through weapons, but through the calendar. Perhaps the world we inhabit is not only fragmented but staged, a grand theater where the past is curated, the future is guided, and the present is a place where real memories and fabricated ones intertwine in an unnerving, perpetual silence. We are taught that for nearly a millennium after the fall of Rome, Europe was plunged into an intellectual darkness. People had no knowledge of how vast the world truly was, no understanding of what lay across the oceans, and certainly no accurate maps. But if that is true, then certain artifacts simply should not exist. And if they do, they shatter the official narrative. The problem arises when certain maps don't match the level of knowledge we are told existed during the so-called Dark Ages. The most famous, and perhaps most inexplicable, example is the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, this map is a genuine historical document, currently housed in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. On the surface, it's a stunning piece of Renaissance cartography, but when you look closer, it becomes a document of impossibility. It accurately depicts the coastline of South America, the west coast of Africa, and most controversially, a portion of the northern coast of Antarctica, a continent that would not be officially discovered for another 300 years. Even more shocking, the map appears to show the Antarctic coastline as it would appear free of its massive ice cap, a condition that has not existed for at least 6,000 years. How is this possible? According to Piri Reis himself, inscribed on the map, this was not his own original work. It was a compilation, pieced together from many ancient source maps, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. The origins of these source maps, he wrote, remain unexplained to this day. How could a map created before the full age of European exploration portray the Americas with such accuracy? How did cartographers of a forgotten age possess data that, according to official history, was not yet discovered? And the most pressing question of all, where are those original source maps now? Archaeologists, historians, and independent researchers all point to one place, a familiar suspect in our investigation: the Vatican's secret archives. Buried deep underground, behind layers of extreme access restrictions and papal prohibitions, the Vatican holds one of the largest and most important collections of ancient maps in the world. Yet it is estimated that less than 1% of this collection has ever been made public. The rest remain sealed, uncatalogued for public view, unverified and uncopied. And among those fragile, priceless sheets of parchment, according to whispers and the accounts of the few who have been granted limited access, lie geographic traces that no one can explain through conventional history. There are coastlines depicted long before their official discovery. There are entire continents and islands that no longer exist. There are journeys mapped out that are completely absent from our history books, yet align perfectly with modern satellite data. This raises a profound and disturbing question. Was Europe truly as ignorant as we have been taught? Or could there have been a class of scholars, clerics, and cartographers who knew far more about the true shape of the world but were forbidden to speak of it? Was this knowledge suppressed, replaced by a sanitized version of history, where the Church could later sponsor voyages of discovery to lands it may have already known existed? Let us consider the story of the Zeno brothers, Niccolo and Antonio, Venetian navigators from the late 14th century. A map, published by their descendant in 1558, purports to detail a journey they made into the North Atlantic around 1390. The map shows lands called Friesland, Icaria, and Estatiland, and depicts Greenland free of ice. For centuries, the map was dismissed as a hoax, but recent geological and oceanographic studies have suggested that the map may contain accurate depictions of subglacial topography, knowledge that should have been impossible to obtain in the 14th century. Were the Zeno brothers liars, or did they have access to an ancient map, a remnant of a lost tradition of knowledge that the rest of Europe had been forced to forget? If the Vatican holds these maps, what exactly are they protecting? Are they protecting the truth? Are they protecting their own power? Or are they protecting a version of the world that, if revealed, might topple the entire carefully constructed structure of history as we know it? A map, after all, is more than a tool of navigation. It is how humanity defines its place in the world. If you don't know where you are, you can be led anywhere. And for centuries, the Vatican has held that power, the power to redraw the world and then to hide the evidence. When the maps vanish, history ceases to be a journey and becomes a maze where you can only follow the paths chosen for you. And perhaps, deep within the stone vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the way out of that maze still exists, on a brittle piece of parchment you have never been allowed to see. It is a bitter and profound irony. While science is born from curiosity, from the insatiable desire to understand the universe, life, and ourselves, during the era known as the Dark Ages, that very curiosity became a sin that could not be forgiven, not because science was wrong, but because it was dangerously right. When Galileo Galilei peered through his crude, self-made telescope in the early 17th century and declared that the Earth revolved around the sun, he was not merely making a scientific statement. He was shattering an entire worldview, one carefully constructed and fiercely guarded by the Church for over 1,000 years. This was a worldview where mankind, God's special creation, was the physical and spiritual center of the universe, a worldview the Vatican had sealed with faith, scripture, and absolute authority. For his declaration, Galileo, an old and devout man, was put on trial by the Roman Inquisition. He was forced to recant the truth, to kneel and deny the evidence of his own eyes. The charge was vehement suspicion of heresy. He survived but spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a prisoner in his own home. He was not punished because he was a rebel, but because he dared to look to the sky and speak what he saw, a truth that contradicted the official story. But Galileo was not the first, nor the most tragic casualty in this silent war on wisdom. His story is famous, but it is only the tip of a vast, submerged iceberg of intellectual suppression. Let us travel back further to the year 1600 to a bustling square in Rome, the Campo de' Fiori. Here, a man named Giordano Bruno was burned alive. Bruno was a philosopher, a cosmologist, and a Dominican friar. He was no atheist. He believed so deeply in the infinite greatness of God's creation that he could not accept that the universe had only one center or one world. He traveled across Europe, teaching that there were countless suns, countless worlds, and that God's presence was in every star, every planet, every grain of sand. He envisioned an infinite universe, a concept that shattered the cozy, contained cosmos of the Church. For these ideas, the Vatican imprisoned him for 8 years, torturing him in the dungeons of the Inquisition. When he refused to renounce his vision, they declared him an unrepentant heretic, handed him over to secular authorities, and tied him to a stake. As the flames rose, the ecclesiastical court watched on in cold, pious silence. Bruno was just one of thousands. Monks who dared to translate forbidden ancient manuscripts, researchers in ancient medicine who practiced human dissection, astronomers, historians. Anyone who touched knowledge that had not been officially approved by the Church risked the same charge. Heresy. They were tried in secret courts where no objective evidence was needed, only accusation. Sentences ranged from lifelong imprisonment to brutal torture for repentance, or public burning at the stake to purify the soul and serve as a terrifying warning to others. People often speak of the Inquisition as an era of religious terror, but few understand its true function. It was the most sophisticated and ruthless machine ever built to eliminate intellectual dissent. It punished not only individuals but ideas themselves. Books were burned, manuscripts erased, and truth itself was extinguished before it could spread. A book that took a scholar 20 years to write could be reduced to ashes in minutes. More terrifying still, the long, enforced silence that followed made future generations believe those works and those ideas had never existed at all. In such an atmosphere, silence meant survival. Questioning meant death. And over time, silence itself became a form of complicity, allowing an entire continent to drift into a slumber of knowledge that lasted for centuries. The Vatican, wielding absolute power as religious authority, political force, and the sole keeper of knowledge, had no need to prove it was right. It only needed to maintain control, purge those who were too awake, and that was enough to keep the truth buried deep in the darkness. Perhaps no book in human history has been more tightly controlled across the millennia than the Bible. More than just a sacred text, it has served as the legal, political, and social foundation for a vast spiritual empire. Yet, what few people realize is that the Bible we read today is not the original, complete story. It is the result of a long, deliberate process of editing, selecting, excluding, and erasing. The Vatican has never denied this process of canonization, but it has never fully explained why certain texts were excluded, or what might happen if they were ever released to the public with its blessing. Scholars refer to these excluded texts as apocrypha, but the word apocryphal here, in its original sense, does not mean false. It simply means hidden away. These were the writings that were not permitted to circulate, not to be read in church, and not to be included in the official canon of the Bible. Among them are powerful, paradigm-shifting texts: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of Enoch, and the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. These writings present a very different, and for the church, a very dangerous image of Jesus and his teachings. They portray him not as a distant, supernatural figure who died for humanity's sins, but as a spiritual teacher, a guide calling for inner awakening and urging people to seek the kingdom of God within themselves, rather than depending on any external religious institution. Let's look at the Gospel of Thomas, a text discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. There is no narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Instead, it is a collection of esoteric wisdom. Saying 3 reads, Jesus said, "If your leaders say to you, 'Look, the Father's kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you and it is outside you." This is a radical departure from the message of institutional religion. It suggests that divinity is not something to be dispensed by a priest, but something to be discovered through personal gnosis, or knowledge. If that were to be accepted, what then of the Church's unique role? What of its position as the sole intermediary between man and God? The entire foundation of its power would crumble. Some texts go even further, speaking of human history before Adam, describing cycles of cosmic destruction and rebirth on Earth, or referencing the existence of powerful spiritual beings, the archons, who created a flawed material world from which humanity must escape. Such ideas stand in direct, irreconcilable opposition to the simple creation doctrine the Vatican has upheld for thousands of years. And so, rather than allowing these texts into academic and theological discourse, they were stamped as heretical, not to be printed, not to be taught, not to be discussed. For centuries, simply possessing a copy of one of these forbidden gospels could lead to execution, burning at the stake, or life imprisonment. Even more telling, many of these texts were later discovered in the dry sands of Egypt, often near the sites of ancient monasteries, secretly copied and hidden by monks, as if they knew that one day the truth would need to be told. Today, although some of these works have been declassified and republished, the Vatican still refuses to recognize the doctrinal value of any of them. They remain silent. They invoke sacred tradition. Yet with each passing day, the question becomes more obvious. If these writings were truly worthless and false, why hide them so well for so long and with such violent determination? Perhaps what the Vatican fears most is not that people will believe these alternative words, but that people will start asking questions about the official words. And in history, every true awakening has always begun with a question that seemed, at first, perfectly harmless. When we think of medieval monastic orders, we often imagine peaceful, pious monks living in remote monasteries, chanting prayers, tending their gardens, and copying the Bible. But beneath that serene and holy image lay a highly organized, far-reaching network that operated much like a secret intelligence service, whose true mission was not just faith, but the acquisition and control of books. From the 8th century onward, as empires collapsed, libraries disintegrated, and ancient knowledge scattered across the land, the Church embarked on a subtle yet relentless campaign to collect every surviving manuscript before it could fall into what it deemed heretical hands. Who carried out this critical mission? Not popes on their thrones or kings on the battlefield. The task fell to the monastic orders, each with its unique strengths. There were the Benedictines, the oldest and most established, whose monks were present in nearly every major monastery across Italy, France, England, and Germany. There were the Franciscans, whose initial mission was humility and learning, but who also proved adept at reaching into local communities and gaining their trust. And then came the Dominicans, the hounds of the Lord, who would become the future enforcers of the Inquisition. And perhaps the most formidable of all, the Jesuits, founded later but embodying the ultimate fusion of intellect, strategy, and absolute loyalty to the Vatican. Under the noble banner of spreading the faith and preserving religious heritage, these monks were granted access to every land, every private library, and every scholar known to possess valuable manuscripts. They did not arrive with swords, but with polite invitations, fervent prayers, and empty satchels, ready to be filled. Countless ancient texts, Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, covering everything from mathematics and philosophy to astronomy and medicine, were borrowed for safekeeping and never returned. Entire private libraries that once held thousands of diverse books, after a century under the care of monks, were often reduced to shelves containing only the Bible and its approved commentaries. Anything that did not serve church doctrine was removed, rewritten to fit theological narratives, or simply vanished. And the originals, of course, they were not all burned. Burning was barbaric, messy, and public. The Vatican was far more refined. The texts were placed somewhere safe, where no one could see them, access them, or even know how many of them existed. The Vatican's secret archive, as we have already seen, became the final resting place for most of these intellectual treasures. It was through these quiet, persistent, subterranean monastic channels that the Vatican amassed not only the faith of the Western world, but the deepest, most comprehensive memory of human civilization itself. But not everyone bowed their heads. Not every scholar was burned at the stake. Some survived, not by betraying the truth, but by hiding with it. And slowly, over time, across generations, a secret network of resistance began to form. The secret societies. There is no official record pinpointing when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, their traces began to appear. We see strange, non-Christian symbols etched into the stones of churches, mysterious carvings in crypts, and architectural works of remarkable sophistication that contained a knowledge of geometry and engineering well beyond their era. Among them, the most prominent were the Freemasons. Originally guilds of master builders and stonemasons, they evolved into a closed, esoteric intellectual community, rich with codes, rituals, and an intricate hierarchy. They constructed Europe's greatest cathedrals, yet adorned them with symbols seemingly unrelated to Orthodox Christianity. The sun, the moon, the all-seeing eye, spirals, and complex mathematical ratios. They were followed by the Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood rumored to possess ancient wisdom from Egypt and Babylon, passed down through generations in handwritten manuscripts and layered, alchemical metaphors. And there were the alchemists, branded by the church as sorcerers, but who in truth were often chemists, philosophers, and astronomers seeking truths beyond the rigid boundaries of sanctioned faith. These societies shared a common, dangerous thread. They did not necessarily deny religion, but neither did they submit to its absolute authority. They believed there existed a primordial stream of knowledge, a prisca theologia or ancient theology, that was deeper, older, and truer than the religious institutions that later sought to redefine reality. And most crucially, they suspected that the Vatican had seized much of that ancient knowledge and buried it behind its stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as a form of underground communication, a way to pass on truth through imagery during times when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, symbols like the letter G, representing God, geometry, or gnosis, and the compass and square all encoded ancient wisdom understood only by those who were initiated. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican. That would have been suicide. But in the shadows, they served as a counterbalance. They did not seek to overthrow religious authority, only to ensure that the ancient flame of human knowledge was not entirely extinguished. And this raises a deeper question. If secret societies managed to preserve fragments of the truth for centuries, it means that even the Vatican could not control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves traces. And sometimes, it is those who operate quietly on the fringes who hold the final key, the one that can unlock the door leading out of the Dark Ages. When we think of medieval monastic orders, we often imagine peaceful, pious monks living in remote monasteries, chanting prayers, tending their gardens, and copying the Bible. But beneath that serene and holy image lay a highly organized, far-reaching network that operated much like a secret intelligence service, whose true mission was not just faith, but the acquisition and control of books. From the 8th century onward, as empires collapsed, libraries disintegrated, and ancient knowledge scattered across the land, the Church embarked on a subtle yet relentless campaign to collect every surviving manuscript before it could fall into what it deemed heretical hands. Who carried out this critical mission? Not popes on their thrones or kings on the battlefield. The task fell to the monastic orders, each with its unique strengths. There were the Benedictines, the oldest and most established, whose monks were present in nearly every major monastery across Italy, France, England, and Germany. There were the Franciscans, whose initial mission was humility and learning, but who also proved adept at reaching into local communities and gaining their trust. And then came the Dominicans, the hounds of the Lord, who would become the future enforcers of the Inquisition. And perhaps the most formidable of all, the Jesuits, founded later but embodying the ultimate fusion of intellect, strategy, and absolute loyalty to the Vatican. Under the noble banner of spreading the faith and preserving religious heritage, these monks were granted access to every land, every private library, and every scholar known to possess valuable manuscripts. They did not arrive with swords, but with polite invitations, fervent prayers, and empty satchels, ready to be filled. Countless ancient texts, Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, covering everything from mathematics and philosophy to astronomy and medicine, were borrowed for safekeeping and never returned. Entire private libraries that once held thousands of diverse books, after a century under the care of monks, were often reduced to shelves containing only the Bible and its approved commentaries. Anything that did not serve church doctrine was removed, rewritten to fit theological narratives, or simply vanished. And the originals, of course, they were not all burned. Burning was barbaric, messy, and public. The Vatican was far more refined. The texts were placed somewhere safe, where no one could see them, access them, or even know how many of them existed. The Vatican's secret archive, as we have already seen, became the final resting place for most of these intellectual treasures. It was through these quiet, persistent, subterranean monastic channels that the Vatican amassed not only the faith of the Western world, but the deepest, most comprehensive memory of human civilization itself. But not everyone bowed their heads. Not every scholar was burned at the stake. Some survived not by betraying the truth, but by hiding with it. And slowly, over time, across generations, a secret network of resistance began to form. The secret societies. There is no official record pinpointing when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, their traces began to appear. We see strange, non-Christian symbols etched into the stones of churches, mysterious carvings in crypts, and architectural works of remarkable sophistication that contained a knowledge of geometry and engineering well beyond their era. Among them, the most prominent were the Freemasons. Originally guilds of master builders and stonemasons, they evolved into a closed, esoteric intellectual community, rich with codes, rituals, and an intricate hierarchy. They constructed Europe's greatest cathedrals, yet adorned them with symbols seemingly unrelated to Orthodox Christianity. The sun, the moon, the all-seeing eye, spirals, and complex mathematical ratios. They were followed by the Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood rumored to possess ancient wisdom from Egypt and Babylon, passed down through generations in handwritten manuscripts and layered, alchemical metaphors. And there were the alchemists, branded by the church as sorcerers, but who in truth were often chemists, philosophers, and astronomers seeking truths beyond the rigid boundaries of sanctioned faith. These societies shared a common, dangerous thread. They did not necessarily deny religion, but neither did they submit to its absolute authority. They believed there existed a primordial stream of knowledge, a prisca theologia or ancient theology, that was deeper, older, and truer than the religious institutions that later sought to redefine reality. And most crucially, they suspected that the Vatican had seized much of that ancient knowledge and buried it behind its stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as a form of underground communication, a way to pass on truth through imagery during times when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, symbols like the letter G, representing God, geometry, or gnosis, and the compass and square all encoded ancient wisdom understood only by those who were initiated. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican. That would have been suicide. But in the shadows, they served as a counterbalance. They did not seek to overthrow religious authority, only to ensure that the ancient flame of human knowledge was not entirely extinguished. And this raises a deeper question. If secret societies managed to preserve fragments of the truth for centuries, it means that even the Vatican could not control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves traces. And sometimes, it is those who operate quietly on the fringes who hold the final key, the one that can unlock the door leading out of the Dark Ages. We began this journey with a question. Was the Dark Ages a historical accident or a deliberate cover-up? We have traveled through a landscape of silent collapses, phantom time, impossible maps, forbidden knowledge, and modern myths. We have seen how a single institution, by positioning itself as the sole keeper of truth, could gain the power to define reality itself. History, we have discovered, is not a river that flows naturally to the sea. It is a current that can be dammed, diverted, and polluted. The Vatican, perhaps with what it saw as noble intentions, to provide order in an age of chaos, to protect a fragile faith, became the master engineer of that current. By controlling what was written, what was preserved, and what was taught, it created a historical narrative that served its own endurance. It built a world shrouded in a fog of unknowing, a world where it held the only lamp. And we, centuries later, are still living in the echoes of that world. We are born into a timeline we did not verify. We are taught a history we did not question. We consume stories that reinforce a narrative we believe to be true. We are born into a prison of the mind, but its walls are invisible, constructed from the bricks of accepted knowledge and the mortar of cultural consensus. So, what is the ultimate lesson from history's greatest cover-up? It is this: the most enduring form of control is not force, but the control of memory. You don't need chains to enslave a population if you can convince them they have always been this way. You don't need to burn every book if you can simply write the only textbooks they are allowed to read. You don't need to build physical walls if you can build a history, so convincing that people will never dare to look over them. The story of the Dark Ages is a warning. It teaches us that truth is not a monument, solid and eternal. It is a flame, fragile and easily extinguished. It requires constant protection, not by guardians who would hide it away, but by brave individuals willing to ask uncomfortable questions. The purpose of this journey was not to provide you with all the answers. It was to arm you with the right questions, to encourage you to look at the smooth, polished surface of official history and see the cracks beneath, to question why some documents are sealed away in vaults, to ask who benefits from the stories we are told, to wonder if the darkness we fear in the past was not a natural night, but a shadow cast by something large and powerful, standing just out of view. The true past may be locked away, but the key to unlocking it is not hidden in a secret archive. It is within you. It is your curiosity. It is your skepticism. It is your courage to say, "Show me the evidence." History does not need you to believe. It only needs you to ask again. And if this journey has made you question what once seemed clear, then perhaps you have just taken your first crucial step out of the shadows and into a truth that has been waiting for a very long time to be rediscovered. If you believe this story is worth continuing, hit subscribe. Not just to follow our channel, but to join a community dedicated to keeping these unanswered questions alive. Because sometimes, a single right question is enough to shake the foundations of a past that was built to be locked forever.